Good evening. Tonight, the electoral team at Anniversary Towers is in the spotlight. IEBC Commissioner Roselyn Akombe has resigned. The chairperson, Wafula Chebukati, says he is besieged, and the silence from the other 5 electoral commissioners is deafening. Is the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission compromised? And will Kenya hold a fresh presidential election in 1 week? This is the big story tonight. I'm Yvonne Okwara Matole. Now, KTN News has obtained a memo from the recently resigned Commissioner Roselyn Akombe, written to the IEBC chairperson. The contents of this memo, dated 9th October 2017, just 10 days before her resignation, are explosive. In this bulletin, we will dig deeper into the alleged divisions at the IEBC and the reasons behind Akombe's exit. But first, let's begin with the shocking revelations from Roselyn Akombe and the IEBC chairperson, Wafula Chebukati.
I've made this point on numerous occasions to my colleagues at the Commission. I've made several attempts to make critical changes, but all my motions have been defeated by a majority of the commissioners. Under such conditions, it's difficult to guarantee free, fair, and credible elections.
I had gotten to a point whereby I felt that I had no more contribution to make because I only had 1 vote. And the more we continue voting on issues that are fundamental, the more I realize that as long as Chairman Chebukati continues to have only 2 votes, we cannot make progress in the Commission. We cannot guarantee a credible process come the 26th of October.
All right, so let's speak to Sophia Wanuna, our lead reporter on this show. And this has been a story that's been unfolding in many ways since that news of that resignation at 5 o'clock this morning. Sophia Wanuna joining us from the KTN newsroom. Sophia, good evening. Let's start by talking about what we do know, because we've heard from the now former Commissioner Akombe, as well as from the chair, Wafula Chebukati. Where are the others?
Pin drop silence from the other 5 commissioners, Yvonne, tonight, hearing from now, as you said, former Commissioner Roselyn Akombe. Early this morning, remember, it was a flurry of calls coming in at around 5 a.m. when news broke that she had actually resigned. And later on this afternoon, from the chair, Wafula Chebukati, in essence, once it's been described as an ultimatum, saying if things remain as they are, he cannot, in his right conscience as a lawyer, be the national returning officer for the repeat presidential election. So the other 5 commissioners, what we are hearing, they're categorical from sources within the commission that these are personal statements. They should not be read by Kenyans as IEBC speaking. They should be read as IEBC Chair Wafula Chebukati and now the former commissioner. Also, what we are hearing from them is that they continue to keep their eyes on the 26th of October repeat poll. Yvonne.
And that is interesting, but, you know, there have been intrigues within the electoral management body from before the election, but specifically after the Supreme Court verdict. There have been intrigues, there's been back and forth, we've seen memos. Talk to us about this, because you've been reporting on this issue for the last couple of months. You've been speaking to persons in the body. What do we know? What are some of the behind-the-scenes intrigues?
Indeed, Yvonne, let's look back at where really the public started seeing publicly some of what was playing out in the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. After the Supreme Court announced the presidential election, we saw the chairperson of the IEBC come out, of course, acknowledging that they, as a commission, disappointed with the ruling, were going to abide by it. And very categorical of his speech at the time was that whilst the commissioners had just come into office in January this year, there had been no changes at the Secretariat level. And what he'd indicated at the time is that he'd invite the DPP to conduct investigations as to individuals who may have committed any acts of criminality that warranted them not to continue to being part of the commission going forward. Because remember, the last commissioners exited office after political pressure that made it unbearable for the country to go forward with them in office. Then after that press conference, Yvonne, many Kenyans will remember that infamous memo that was a lot like bombshell from the chair. He's never disowned it, and in fact went on ahead later to pretty much say yes, it had come from his office. So that memo leaks, and it was a memo that raised very tough questions in regard to the 8th of August election. A lot of the questions that NASA had presented in court as a petition of things that went wrong but had not been acknowledged at the time by the IEBC. So you have the chair coming out later and raising all of these questions, but to date we have not publicly at least known of the responses of that memo from the CEO of the commission. But after that bombshell of a memo from the chair, then we saw that retreat, because the heat, the pressure, the attention and focus was all on the commission, retreating to Naivasha, where I was covering that as well. And after a day of even spiritual intervention, we saw a spiritual leader coming in to speak to them, a motivational speaker as well, talking to them about legacy and the importance of putting country first. Then in the end of the day, they came out appearing to be speaking from same script, saying hatchet has been buried, white smoke is out of Naivasha, we are one, we're going to work forward and work to organize a fresh poll. However, that did not last long. Another leaked memo, Yvonne, that one again calling for the suspension of the ICT boss Mohati, as well as 3 others. And then after that, the intrigues continue. We saw a tweet from the official IEBC handle saying that memo should not be taken seriously, as it was released before conclusive discussions were had in the commission. So this just pointing to a split commission, the back and forth. You hear one thing there, another thing here, and it's a lot of what we had Akombe, not only in her letter, but also earlier on in the interview with Michael Gitonga, alluding to that on one hand, the chairperson would seek to make a certain proposal or do certain things or changes, and the same would be outnumbered when it came to a vote at the commission level. So Yvonne, there have been several intrigues, and a lot as well has been said in as far as those factions that lie within the IEBC.
Yes, and speaking of factions, we do hear that there are factions. At least that's what, has been coming out from all the intrigues you've just talked about. And today we've at least heard from the chair, Chebukati, and the former commissioner, Akombe. And they sort of seem to be saying the same thing, perhaps in one faction. Tell us about these factions that we hear about, and who's on what side, and what's going on within the commission.
What we're hearing, especially from Akombe, her letter resigning, and earlier today in that interview, talking about 4 commissioners, that they were saying through caution to the wind, not regarding the law, and pretty much appeared to have hell-bent sort of approach in as far as whatever decisions and approach in the commission are concerned. But one very telling scenario, Yvonne, just to take us back, when the memo to the CEO was leaked from the chair, 4 commissioners, or rather 5, a memo came out, a letter actually disowning that memo came out, allegedly signed by 5 commissioners. 5 commissioners being the vice chair of the commission, the other commissioners Boya Molu, Paul Kurgat, Margaret Mwachana, as well as Abdi Gulie. Then moments after that, we had 2 of those disowning that statement, and that was Margaret Mwachanya and Paul Kurgat. But the intrigues continued even further. Paul Kurgat later going back on that statement, saying, in fact, he agrees with the initial statement that was disowning this statement from the memo from the chair. And so, in a sense, when you're talking about 4 commissioners that we've largely heard being talked about, that have largely been working to ensure certain ends are met, quote unquote, allegedly from what the reports that are coming out. We hear Connie Maina, Paul Kurgat, Boya Maina, as well as Abdi Gulie definitely appearing to be reading from the same script. And this is according to sources within the IEBC, those that are looking inward in as far as the developments that we've witnessed in the recent past. As for Margaret Mwachanya, Mini saying that she has chosen to get herself out of this kind of an arrangement where it's clear that even before a matter comes for discussion, an end or a decision is already preconceived even before those matters are actually argued out. So these are the kind of factions we are seeing. So that chair on one hand, former commissioner now Akombe on the other, Margaret likely to be in the middle on that side, and then those are the 4 commissioners allegedly and being strongly seen to be reading from the same script, alongside strong and senior officials at the Secretariat, as we had been talked about, not only by Akombe, but as well as the chair, who said that those that have been indicted throughout this process must step aside. So this is one of those stories, Yvonne, will keen eye on in terms of what implications will it have going forward.
Yes, indeed. And those factions that you talk about are rather interesting and paint a picture of what many Kenyans may not be able to know from the inside. Sophia Wanuna, thanks very much for that. So let's speak to somebody who has actually been on the inside and perhaps understands the inner workings of the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. And that is the now former Vice Chair of the IEBC, Lilian Mahiri-Zaja, who joins me now on phone. Lilian, thank you for speaking with us on The Big Story tonight. We're hearing a lot of intrigues about the voting and how that takes place and how decisions are made. You were there not too long ago. Explain to us how decisions are made within the commission. Is it a majority vote? Is it consensus? How does it work?
Thank you for having me here on the discussion. I would like to say that in terms of decision making, for any decision to be adopted by the commission, the rule is that the quorum must be met in the first place. And as it is every good practice for any in a proper manner, there is always need for consensus. And if there is a contentious issue, it's good to have, the conditions, being ironed out, whatever is difficult to be ironed out, so that you build consensus around the issues.
All right, I heard you, sorry, Lilian, I heard you talking about quorum. What is the quorum like, or at least while you were there? How many?
The commission was national, and this is the Constitution. The quorum was five commissioners and making the decision. And the chairman, of course, would guide the discussion and will all deliberate and come to an agreement. And in most cases, I would say the SAC Hassan team to agreement via consensus. Only one time we had to make a decision through voting.
Okay. And what happens in the event of a conflict? I mean, what then? Do you take a vote? Does the chairman have the veto vote? What happens then? How do you broker, consensus out of conflict?
We were fortunate not to have those conflicts where you get to bring in the chairman to exercise his veto. And as I said, we had consensus building and we agreed on the issues. Of course, there is always disagreement on a few things here and there. But we found one made all agreed on the decisions that were taken.
All right. Here's my final question to you, the relationship between the Secretariat and the commissioners, because we're hearing a lot of that now about a seemingly huge rift between the two. Could you explain to us how it works, who's in charge, who gives instructions and orders?
Yes, this has always been a problematic question since we established commissions, either before the Constitution of 2010 and even thereafter. With the SAC-led team, we were very clear that the commission, which is made up of the chairman, the commissioners, and the CEO and the opposition member of the commission, that is the policy organ of the commission and would give the strategic direction of the commission, take decisions, and of course, on advice from the technical arm of the commission, which is the Secretariat, led by the CEO. So in most cases, decisions are made by the commission, and then they are implemented by the Secretariat, which does the day-to-day running of the commission, the administrative matters of the commission. And in that way, we are able to separate the policy issues. And again, the decision-making process trickles from the commission. The CEO is part of the commission when decisions are made, so he is able to take down every decision that is for implementation by the Secretariat and ensures that he oversees and oversights the technical team, that is the directors, the managers, and all the way down to the field on how those decisions are implemented.
All right. Okay. Thank you for that. Lilian Mahiri-Zaja, who's the former vice chair of the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, giving us an understanding. And that may then perhaps set the tone for what we're about to tell you, because she's explained, what happens there. However, If this memo is anything to go by, then it will explain the frustrations that Commissioner Akombe claims to have undergone within the Commission. This is a memo, like we told you in the beginning, that we have gotten our hands on. It was written from now former Commissioner Akombe to the chair, expressing her frustrations on the 9th of October, just 10 days before her resignation. So it's an 8-point memo. I will go through just some of the highlights and the most important ones, where she talks of her frustrations, her interactions with the Secretariat and indeed with fellow commissioners. So one of the issues that she brought up was the relationship between the Secretariat and the committee which she chaired, which was the Election Operations Committee. And she talked about the fact that what would happen with the committee is that they would put an issue for consideration before the plenary. But since September, this would be after the election, that the CEO and the secretary of her committee would choose to bring those issues directly to the plenary, and therefore creating what she terms as a dysfunctional relationship, and therefore making her oversight role and that of the other two commissioners obsolete. She then goes on to ask whether all decisions are controlled by the Secretariat and the majority vote in the plenary. Then there was the other issue of the Keems kits, and this will be interesting to a number of people, which was with respect to the issue of dead voters. She talked about having made a decision before August the 8th not to cross the register of voters, that they brought this practice potentially back, opening the door for irregularities and fraud. She also then raised other issues, including the cyberbullying, which she says was politically instigated, and pressure for politicians to have some of them resign in an attempt to have a team that is responsive to their needs. This is where it gets interesting. She talks about intimidation that goes all the way up until the boardroom, where she says, and I quote, with even one commissioner threatening to go physical against me in the 18th September plenary meeting. Could one still talk of a conducive environment for free and fair, credible elections under these circumstances when this was going all the way up into the boardroom? Here's another thing. She decried the fact that no tough questions had been asked of the staff at Nairobi at the headquarters. She said that had been done of the returning officers and presiding officers out in the counties, but that nothing had been done. This is what she says. The Supreme Court found we lost at the Supreme Court because of non-compliance to the court orders regarding scrutiny of forms and opening of servers. She asks, who was responsible for ensuring compliance to the court orders? Then she talks about the project team. She says, even though that is in place, nothing seems to have changed, and that all key issues relating to the election, ranging from technology to training, are still being managed by the same headquarters staff whose confidence the commission chair had questioned. And it goes on. There's a number of other issues. I will get into this one. She talked about a meeting that she tried to set up on the 4th of September with top leadership of Jubilee and NASA, and that the majority of the commissioners decided against the meetings. She said she had to cancel them. She even talked of the meeting that took place between Raila Odinga, Kalonzo Musyoka, and the chair and the vice chair, and that during that meeting, one of the issues on the table was staff changes, as per a document that was circulated to NASA. But she says nothing happened, where one of the issues of discussion was that a number of staff who had been mentioned adversely by both sides would at least take annual leave. She says that did not happen. Finally, she decries the ICT audit system, which she says was approved. But as at the time of writing the memo on the 9th of December, that ICT audit had not commenced. She asks finally, are these deliberate delays, stalling like what happened between the 28th and the 29th of August on implementation of court orders on access to the server? So these might just paint some light into just what was going on and perhaps what led to her resignation from the commission tonight. That is a memo that was sent by Roselyn Akombe to the chair, expressing her frustrations. This is a memo that we have gotten our hands on here on The Big Story on KTN News, and it just perhaps gives you an insight into what has been going on inside the commission. So interesting times with just 7 days to go to this election. All right, so the chair, Wafula Chebukati, had quite a bit to say. He had a statement earlier today. I'll be speaking to my guests in just a moment. Tonight, I have with me the vice chair of the Jubilee Party, David Morathe, and then I also have Honorable Otiende Amolo, who's a member of parliament for Rarieda. I'd just like your reactions. I'll start with you, Otiende, to this memo that we have just obtained tonight.
Thank you, Yvonne. I think the chicken are coming home to roost. Everything that is now emerging from Dr. Akombe's memo, her statements earlier, the statement by the chairman, vindicate what we've been saying for the last 6 months, before the August elections and after the August elections. Unfortunately, we are in a polarized country where nobody cares to listen. They treat them as being views of NASA, which then are dismissed by Jubilee, and everybody thinks it is okay to move on. And yet, we are shuttling to the precipice.
David, your reaction?
Wow. I listened, and you're talking about the 18th of September. We are now on the 18th of October.
No, this particular memo was on the 9th of October. But she's referring to issues from
18th of September.
Yes.
It's one whole month since that altercation happened. And you wonder why it took her a whole month now to feel she can't take it anymore. I think she's dishonest because she left the country purportedly to go to Dubai to supervise the printing of the ballot papers. She went freely as a commissioner. She went to work. And she then flew from Dubai to the United States. I think that for me is a bit unbecoming of a servant. In fact, we find that it was a mistake, and my friend Wakili here knows, if you hold dual citizenship, the law says you cannot be an employee of a public commission. We came to realize just the other day that she was both a US citizen and a Kenyan citizen.
So
that in itself was criminal.
Known before?
We never knew. We only knew the day she was stopped at the airport when the US ambassador intervened, because they do when you are holding their citizens from traveling. And in retrospect, maybe it was a good thing. People had enough reason to suspect that she was up to no good, even then, when she was leaving. Doesn't that paint a bad picture for the president who actually signed, this into it and the vetting process? You see, when people falsify papers, and the people who are supposed to do the due diligence don't do the due diligence. In fact...
So did she falsify papers? Is that what you're saying?
It appears that there was no declaration, because if there was a declaration, she's a lawyer.
Okay.
And for heaven's sake, people know what should and what should not be.
All right.
Therefore, the people who are interviewing them should have known that if she holds dual citizenship, she's disqualified from being a member.
David, that aside, though, I wonder what your thoughts are to a number of the issues that she has raised in the memo. I mean, I think that'll be another matter that perhaps will require investigation, if according to what you say. But what are your thoughts about the contents specifically of the memo? I mean, she's talked about, ICT audit not beginning. She's talked about, fights, intimidation. She's also talked about the issue of dead voters, that could come up to compromise the quality of the elections. So what are your thoughts to the specific contents?
I think that is also not honest. You see, what has been interfered with in this instance by the amendments in the law is only the transmission part of it, where they're saying if you don't have a 3G network like last time or the 4G network, you could still rely on the manual, because the manual is supposed to be tallied and signed for by all the agents and the POs and the ROs. Because if you remember, Yvonne, this election was nullified because of processes, not because people didn't vote right, not because they were not counted right, not because they were not tallied correct at the constituencies and at the National Tallying Center. The issue was about electronic transmission. Now, the KIMS kit, which identified the voters, I myself, I went in, you lock in, pap, it works. So there's no possibility of a dead voter voting then and even now. It is practically not possible. The KIMS kit is not being interfered with at identification.
Okay. I'd like to hear from you, Otiende. Do you agree with everything that's been raised in the memo? She also talks about pressure from some politicians to have some of them resign in an attempt to have a team that is more responsive to their needs. What are your thoughts as to the revelations? Do you agree with just about everything that's come up in this memo?
You know, Yvonne, anybody who honestly is patriotic and cares about this country would not have the attitude my friend David Murathe seems to have here, would not have the attitude that the president and the deputy president seem to have. You cannot be in a country and you are in a vehicle where the driver tells you that in this state of the vehicle, I cannot drive. You need to stop the vehicle, let us examine it. And then you say, stop talking, continue driving. That is what the DP is saying. I mean, it is so utterly reckless. There must come a time when the president must remember that he's not just the head of government, he's the head of state. And there's a time he must pull away from the bunch of Jubilee guys and remember that now, as a statesman, as the president and head of state, he needs to do certain things that will put us back in track. My friend David Murathe has not answered any of the questions you've asked for obvious reasons, because they are not concerned about credible elections. The chairman of the IBC tells you, I cannot conduct a credible election in this state. They say, shut up and continue with your work. He says, we need to address certain fundamental issues. I have served in 2 commissions, including as a chair. I can tell you a lot about the working of commissions. What I heard from Chebukati today is very worrying. The man, his mind is clear. His heart is in the right place, but his body is weak. There are things he needed to have done. As the returning officer, none of the other commissioners are returning officers. It is the chair. And therefore, he needs to put his foot down on certain fundamental things. And those who do not agree should either resign or ask for him to be removed. I think that it is good what he said, because it gives a clearer picture. And you can see that he's a man struggling with his conscience to do the right thing in very difficult circumstances. The one thing that must be done, Dr. Akombe already resigned, and her reasons are legitimate, and we can go through them. I've read, I read her statement. I listened to her interview on KTN early this morning, and you can see that she is a lady who meant well for this country. There are only 2 kinds of commissioners. There are commissioners who do what they swore to do. That is the right thing. And there are those who choose to do what is convenient.
All right, I want us to go into a break, but I just want to ask you a very quick question. Should the chair, Chebukati, resign?
I think that if what he set out is not addressed, and it is clear that Jubilee is not interested in addressing it, I think the heroic thing would be for him to resign.
David, should he resign, yes or no?
It will not make a difference. You know, we have now amended the law, and that has been addressed, so that if the chairman resigns, the vice chair
will take over.
Steps in.
All right, okay. You're watching The Big Story. We're taking a quick break. We're speaking now about the chair. We'll be hearing a lot more from him because, remember, he made that statement earlier this afternoon.